Hello everyone.
Hi there, welcome back to Book Club on Telescola. We are your hosts. I'm Mr. Darrell and this is...
I am Miss Maka.
Today, Ms. Maka, we're going to talk about The Woman in White.
By Wilkie Collins.
Now, this was his fifth published novel. We haven't spoken about him very much, but it was published in 1859, very early, and importantly, it was one of the first mystery novels. And we should know that modern critics and readers actually regard it as Collins's best novel, a view with which Collins himself agrees. So the author and his fans agree on the same book.
Yes, exactly. He also thinks that
it was his best book. Let's have a look at the agenda.
Definitely. From the very beginning, we will introduce you to the new vocabulary. After that, we will talk about the writer, Wilkie Collins. Then, we will talk about the summary of the book.
From there, we will look at the characters, the moving parts of this summary. We'll move on to the setting, like when the story happened, where the story happened, and then we'll have some of the main themes of the story for you.
And finally, we will give you an interesting homework.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a lesson without some homework.
Sure, Mr. Darrell. So now let's look at our first word.
To encounter. To encounter. It's a verb. It means to meet, especially unexpectedly or in a conflict situation.
მოულოდნელად შეხვედრა.
Asylum. It's a noun. Asylum. Asylum. This is not so much in use anymore. It's a word relevant to the book, but not so much use in our modern time. It was an institution for the maintenance and care of people who are mentally ill or who are orphans, people who are on the margins of society.
პოლიტიკური თავშესაფარი.
Our next word is a verb, to comprise. To comprise. This is something that includes or contains within itself.
შეიცავს, მოიცავს.
Our next word is a noun, confession. Confession. This is the acknowledgement or admittance of something that is possibly secret.
აღიარება.
Our next verb is to drown. To drown. This is to die under water or to suffocate in liquid.
ჩაძირვა, დახრჩობა.
Our next verb is to conspire. To conspire. This is to agree together with someone else, especially secretly, to do something wrong, evil, or illegal.
შეთქმულების მოწყობა.
Our next adjective is suspiciously. Suspiciously, tending to cause excite suspicion, doing something that's questionable and you don't know what's going on.
საეჭვოდ.
Our next noun is gravestone. Gravestone. This is a stone marking a grave, usually giving the person's name, date of birth, date of death as well, and other information.
საფლავის ქვა.
Okay, well, let's move on to the author.
Yeah, it is high time.
We've never spoken about this author before, so let's give you some of the basic information. His full name is Wilkie Collins, born in 1824, died in 1889, and he was an English novelist and a playwright.
Yeah, as we have already mentioned, but I think we should mention it just one more time, that this book has been called the first modern English detective detective novel.
So before even Sherlock Holmes and all those
Exactly,
characters.
It is even older.
He was born, his father was a London painter, and the family moved to Italy when Collins, our author, was 12. And he lived there and in France for a while, and he learned to speak Italian and French.
And on publishing his very first novel, Antonina, in 1850, Collins met our favorite writer, Charles Dickens, who became his very close friend. They two also worked together on drama and fiction.
Through his novels, this author reached financial stability, and he had an international following by the 1860s. but he started to suffer from gout, which is a disease of the body, and he started to take opium to dull the pain, which was probably the worst thing he could have done. He became addicted to opium.
Very sad, and I think this was the reason why his health and his writing quality declined in the 1870s and 1880s. Actually, he was critical, like Collins was critical of the institution of marriage, so probably to defend the women's side.
Yeah, so he's a bit more progressive.
Yes, exactly. More liberal.
More liberal, yeah. The Woman in White our novel today, shows Collins not just as a master of his craft, but as an innovator. So he deserves more respect and more fame. It secured him an international reputation, it sold in large numbers, and it ensured his financial stability, and it allowed him to support friends of his as well.
Yeah, and noted for its suspenseful plot and unique characterization, the successful novel brought Collins fame and success, and he adapted it into a play in 1871. So can you imagine how old it was? Of course, it was much older than Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, definitely, and so he was a writer and a playwright.
Yeah.
Okay, well, he died in 1889 and is buried in West London.
So now I think it is time for the question to our audience. Maybe Mr. Darrell, you have a question to our audience.
I do. What was the ultimate downfall of this talented writer?
The main cause of his downfall was his drug addiction, and he lost his way after it.
Yeah, probably the most dangerous threat for any person who wants to produce anything valuable, right?
There's a lesson there to be learned.
Of course, definitely.
Let's move on.
Yeah, and now let's look at the summary of the story. The dramatic tale, inspired by an actual criminal case, is told through the multiple narrators.
Now there's Frederick Fairley, a wealthy hypochondriac. This means a person who thinks he's got diseases that maybe he doesn't have. So he just thinks that he's sick all the time. He hires a virtuous man named Walter Hartwright to tutor his beautiful niece and heiress, Laura, and her homely, courageous half-sister, Marion Halcomb.
Interesting. Although Hartwright and Laura, they both fall in love, she honors her late father's wish that she marries Sir Percival Glyde, a villain who plans to steal her inheritance.
Glyde is assisted in this by the sinister Count Fosco, a cultured, decadent Italian who became the archetype of subsequent villains in crime novels.
So their plot is threatened by Anne Catherick, a mysterious fugitive from a mental asylum who dresses in white, resembles Laura, and knows the secret of Glyde's illegitimate birth.
A very interesting plot so far. Through perseverance of Hartwright and Marion, Glyde and Fosco are defeated and killed, allowing Hartwright to marry Laura.
Yeah, and now let's ask a question to our audience. So, can you name one of the elements of other future detective stories that was first created in this story?
As you mentioned, Count Fosco is a cultured and decadent Italian who becomes the typical villain in the stories, and he's pretty bored and intelligent enough to want to commit these crimes.
Yeah, that is, I've seen that character type many times in stories.
Yeah, exactly. And the older version actually affected the other possible characters.
There's always something about the original that's more memorable.
Yeah. So I guess that's time to introduce you to the characters.
Yeah. Let's have a look. There's a few characters to look at. We'll do it quickly. We have the first one, Walter Hartwright. He's a young teacher of drawing He's kind of an everyman character. That means someone you can relate to. He's kind of like every person around you. There's nothing special about him. And he's distinguished, however, by a strong sense of justice.
So our next character is Frederick Fairley. So he's a wealthy, hypochondriac landowner, the uncle of Laura, distinguished principally by his mock politeness toward the other characters. Mock politeness, we could say like fake politeness.
Yeah, not a very pleasant characteristic.
And not honest.
Yeah, not honest, yeah. We'll move from there to Laura Fairley, as you mentioned her. Mr. Fairley is gentle and pretty, without any cunning in her. She's a very honest woman, girl. She's his heiress.
Yeah. Our next character is Marion Halcomb, Laura's elder half-sister and companion. Not attractive, but intelligent and very resourceful.
She's described as one of the finest creations in all of Victorian fiction by a critic named John Sutherland.
And I think the most interesting character for me is Anne Catterick, so the woman in white, an eccentric young woman, distinguished by her insistence on white clothes. Looks like more ghost to me.
Ghostly, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And illegitimate daughter of Laura's father. So kind of half-sister of our main character.
And the last character is Count Fosco, Sir Percival's closest friend, and his full name is actually Isidore Ottavio Baldassare Fosco.
So, yeah, a grossly obese Italian mysterious man with a very eccentric past, and generally he's very eccentric, bombastic, urbane but intelligent and menacing. So he keeps canaries and mice as pets.
And he actually greatly admires Marion for her intellect.
What about the question?
Yes, we have a question. Why is Marion Halcomb described as one of the finest creations in all of Victorian literature?
This is because of her characteristics. She is not a very beautiful woman, but at the same time, she is very clever and inventive.
Excellent. That's a big claim, by the way. So they're saying that this woman is one of the finest characters in all of 19th century literature. We have Jane Austen, we have Charlotte Bronte, and people have said that this character, Marion Halcomb, is better than all of those characters.
Yeah, and we would say that the writer in this story emphasizes more the intelligence part of the woman rather than the physical characteristic.
He's a supporter of strong women.
Exactly.
Let's go on to the setting now. I'll talk about the when, and maybe you can talk about the where.
Yeah, let's do so.
So in the 19th century, there's a series of reforms that are reshaping society in Britain, reshaping the local government of society. It's a time when women's rights were not taken seriously. That's also kind of important to the setting. And before 1882, all of a wife's assets, all her money and all her possessions, passed automatically to her husband if she passed away. So this is something that Wilkie questions.
And now, what about the where part? We would say this is Limmeridge House in Cumberland. In response to poor sanitary conditions and outbreaks of cholera in Cumberland, the Public Health Act that was in 1848 and the Local Government Act that was in 1858 allowed for the formation of local boards of health in the areas where there were more people, living more people. These local boards were responsible for the water supplies, for drainage and sewerage and paving and cleaning.
Cleansing?
Cleansing, yeah.
So there's a lot of change going on at this time. Social change, city change, urban change.
And due to the epidemic, cholera.
And then this author comes in and he pushes a kind of a progressive message as well.
Exactly.
Well, why don't you ask the audience a question?
Yeah, we do have a question to our audience. Do you think there is a political element in this story?
I think there is a political element in this story. It reflects Wilkie's concerns and worries for the status of women, which he puts into the story effectively.
That's true. So yeah, so he is a kind of progressive writer.
Yeah, he is, and of course, this is social problem as well, but very closely connected to politics as well.
And he puts it all into a detective story. So I think it's quite fascinating and probably worth reading.
Yeah, and that's what we are going to discuss in our next part, Mr. Darrell.
We have the oppression of women. Now, a theme of the story is the unequal position of married women in law at the time. Laura Glyde's interests have been neglected by her uncle, and her fortune of £20,000, which is enormous, a huge sum of money for that time, by default goes to her husband on her death.
Collins dedicated this novel to Brian Proctor, poet and commissioner for lunacy, and was inspired by the case of Louise Nottage, who was abducted and imprisoned for the monetary convenience of her family.
The real background behind the story there. Women could be imprisoned in lunatic asylums if they became embarrassing or inconvenient to their husbands or fathers, which is terrible.
Ooh, so I think that period really needed these type of
Reform.
writers. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Our next topic is earliest detective novel. Of course, it is very important to mention as the kind of pioneer in detective stories. The story is sometimes considered an early example of detective fiction, with protagonist Walter Hortwright employing many of the techniques of later private detectives. So we can say that it's like
They copy, I mean, they're borrowing from him.
or giving some kind of example, this is how you should be like trying to write about something, investigators or detectives.
Yeah, and I think there's something about original writers,
Yeah.
they're more memorable. As you mentioned earlier, the use of multiple narrators is also used here, including nearly all of the principal characters, and it draws on Collins' his own legal training, as he points out in his introduction. The following quote: "The story here presented will be told by more than one pen, one by one person, as the story of an offense against the laws is told in court by more than one witness."
Yep. And now let's have a question to our audience.
Yes. Do you think stories such as these have the power to change society through entertaining them?
I think yes, stories have the power to change society, but nothing can really beat the active political commitment and the organized method of pushing for societal change.
Yes, very good answer. So, I mean, stories do have an effect, but real political change comes from political action.
Yeah, of course, but maybe this action is inspired by the story that they read. Who knows?
The stories that you read, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. Now, let's just wrap it up everything so that the audience remembers what we've done today. The very first thing, we talked about the author.
And the summary of the story, as you remember, this young artist, Walter Hartwright, one night comes across this ghostly woman dressed in white, your favorite character, and after this encounter, he's hired to investigate this case.
Then we had multiple characters, but we would say, I would mention more that it should be noted that this story has many narrators as characters as well.
Yeah, and remember the setting is the 1850s in England.
And the main themes that we have chosen for you, the very first thing is the oppression of women, and this is the main message of the writer. And the second one that we have chosen is the importance of being pioneer, like the earliest detective novel.
Let's have a look at the vocabulary again. Once more from the very beginning. I'll just say them quickly for pronunciation purposes. To encounter, asylum, to comprise, confession, to drown, to conspire, suspiciously, and gravestone.
Thank you very much. And this is time to reveal what is the homework for today.
Okay, well, this is the question we want answered in your homework answers. Why do you think detective stories are so popular? Give reasons and examples.
როგორ ფიქრობთ, რატომ არის დეტექტიური ჟანრის მოთხრობები ასე პოპულარული? მოიყვანეთ არგუმენტები და მაგალითები.
And please send your answers to the address on the screen.
დავალებები შეგიძლიათ გამოაგზავნოთ ეკრანზე მითითებულ მისამართზე.
Ms. Mako, so what is a typical reason for why people like detective stories?
Let's answer. I will answer it from what I think about it.
Yeah.
So what I like in detective stories is that I have to think a lot. Okay, mostly if you read a romantic story, mostly I know the ending, or in different genres. But in detective stories, there are lots of questions, lots of scenes where you don't have answers, and you have to finish the book in order to get the answer.
Yeah, and detective stories, they're about finding out the truth. And if you are a lover of truth, you kind of love these kinds of stories.
Yes, exactly. So only truth lover people and people who love challenges read detective stories, right? Yeah. I guess that's all for today. And we have to say a very warm goodbye to our audience.
Well, thank you very much for answering and participating in the discussion as well.
Thank you, the TV audience, for watching us and being interested in reading generally.
And I think we shall see them next week.
Yeah, until next week, goodbye.
Yeah, keep reading and goodbye.